Okay, so I'm going to start this video with a disclaimer, and I'm going to repeat it several times so that nobody can misconstrue anything I'm saying here. I do not recommend this for any type of structural welding. If it's important welding, so you're doing like a frame rail or a roll cage or anything like that, don't even think about trying this. But if you're welding on sheet metal and you've got some gaps to fill, this is amazing. So like my life is an eternal quest for knowledge. I'm always looking for new facts, new tricks, new tips, whatever. And last night I'm flipping through and I'm watching some bad Chad, right? And as I'm watching him, he's welding, he's doing a top chop on I don't even know what kind of car it was. But as he's welding, right, so he's got his MIG, okay, and he's welding, and at some point he's got a gap to fill. So he whips out a coat hanger. Why did I not ever think of this, right? He was using the coat hanger as an extra filler metal in this gap that he was trying to fill in the panels. All right, so now I am no stranger to welding with coat hangers. No old timer, especially somebody who welds with gas, oxyacetylene, we all know coat hangers. So this goes back to like when I was like 20 years old, right? And I used to think that you had to go buy specific welding rod to weld with, you know, oxyacetylene. And I go to the welding supply place one day to buy my allotment of welding rods. And I used to do a lot of gas welding because I did a lot of exhaust systems and stuff like that. So they're out of welding rod. So the guy behind the counter says, why don't you just go get some coat hangers? I says, no, I want welding rod. He says, it's the same thing. He says, the wire companies, they leave some of it straight and they package it up as welding rod, and they bend some of it up into the shape of coat hangers, and it's a coat hanger. It's a welding rod. And he's right. He was right, because I did side by side. I took a welding rod and I took a coat hanger and I melted them next to each other. Exactly the same thing. Although I've always been leery of, and you really shouldn't use coated hangers like this, coated coat hangers. White, you know, the painted or the dipped coat hangers, because there's a lot of impurities. So don't use these. But your standard plain metal mild steel coat hanger is a welding rod. All right. So the type of welding that we typically do in the world of cars, you know, we don't use stick welding because it's just too, right? Especially if you're doing sheet metal, right? You can't just take your, that doesn't work. So typically we either use a MIG or a flux core, you know, wire feed, or we'll use gas or TIG. All right. So what this method is, it's a combination of the oxyacetylene / TIG welding, where you're using a filler metal, you're using a filler rod. So in oxyacetylene, you're using the flame to melt the steel. In TIG, you're using the tungsten to create an arc to melt the steel. And in the other two, MIG and flux core, you're using wire feed. Well, this is a combination of both. This is just putting the concept of adding a filler metal to the wire feed. So if you've got a gap you've got to fill, instead of having to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to try to bridge the gap and create all kinds of crazy heat, well, once you've got your arc going, you just start feeding in filler metal, a coat hanger. This is brilliant. So let me show you what I'm working on over here. So I took a couple of random pieces of metal, different gauges and whatnot, and I've been playing with this whole idea. And this is fantastic. So this panel here started out with a bigger gap, so I made a big gap to a smaller gap. So these are just about butted. I stopped here. But you can see where I just kept feeding my filler rod in as I went along, and it filled the gap perfectly. There was a lot less heat involved because I didn't have to keep going back and forth. I didn't have to keep bridging. Sorry for the traffic, guys. I didn't have to keep bridging that gap. I just filled with the rod. Here, this is thicker metal, and what I found here is that trying to weld a continuous line the way you would in something like this, I'm having a hard time keeping the filler rod from, let's say, overheating or going in too fast, and I end up with a lot of balls, a lot of slag and stuff like that. So what I found was, when I'm doing it like this, here. You lay the rod into the gap and then just weld through the rod or into the rod. And you go a little bit at a time. So I'm playing around with different wire speeds, different heat. Well, I don't have too many options, heat options on this. But if you've got a regular MIG and you've got a full range of heat settings and a full range of speed settings, you're going to have to dial it in to figure out exactly what is going to work best the item that you're welding. This one here, this welded really nice. And this was another example where, here, let me get myself another welding rod ready. Remember the old days welding with these things, and they get to that point and you start scrounging them up and welding them together so you get yourself another long, welding rod. So So here, I'm just going to lay this into the gap as I weld through it. So it takes some practice. It takes some practice. When the first couple of shots I did with this, I ended up with a lot of blubbly, gappy welds. But it's a feel. It's a feel. It's something you go practice. But like I said, if you're doing sheet metal, if you're just trying to fill some gaps in non-structural metal, like you're doing floor pans or something like that, and you just got that gap, coat hanger, mild steel welding rod, anything like that, just fill it in the same way you would be filling it in with either a TIG or an oxyacetylene setup. And it works great. Nothing structural. Don't ever attempt this on anything structural. All right. I hope you got something out of that. Thank you, Bad Chad. I'll see you tomorrow.